May is the single most active tornado month in the entire calendar year. That is not a theory. That is not a forecast for a particularly bad year. That is the historical average. 275 to 294 tornadoes, confirmed across the United States in May alone every year, based on decades of NOAA records. And now May 2026 is here, and AccuWeather's own long-range severe weather expert said publicly, before this month even started, that May can be an especially active period this season. He did not say it might be, he said it can be. And the atmosphere, as of the first days of May 2026, is already providing proof of concept, with tornado damage reports still being filed from the previous week's outbreaks, new storms targeting the Gulf Coast and Southeast, and a fresh severe weather setup already developing on the SPC's extended outlook for the middle of next week. Nobody is ready for what May brings this month, and May does not care. To understand why May 2026 is sitting at the intersection of multiple overlapping threats simultaneously, you have to understand what has already happened and what is still in motion. Because the month is not starting from a neutral baseline, it is starting from the aftermath of the most violent April severe weather sequence in years, in a season that broke records before winter was even over, with a developing El Niño already beginning to assert its influence on the atmospheric patterns that drive American severe weather from May through summer. Let us go back to where the season stands as of the first week of May, because the context matters enormously for understanding what is coming next. The 2026 severe weather season opened with unprecedented early season violence. An EF2 tornado near Fairview, Oklahoma, in the early months of 2026 killed a mother and daughter along U.S. Highway 60. Additional tornadoes near Beggs in northern Tulsa tore through homes, damaged a middle school, and left thousands without power. A monstrous tornado tore through Union City, Michigan, leveling homes and capturing. Imagery so alarming that footage of the event circulated globally. The storm was photographed briefly pulling ice off a lake's surface as it tracked across the landscape. An EF5 tornado struck Wells County, North Dakota, in June of last year, the first EF5 in over a decade in the United States, serving as a preview of the atmospheric violence that the 2025 to 2026 ENSO transition would eventually produce. The preliminary tornado count for 2025 reached 559, nearly two-thirds of those occurring between March and May. March 2025 set a preliminary monthly tornado count record, and now 2026 has arrived, running at an above-normal pace through early March, before the monster April outbreak sequence added dozens more to the ledger. The April 22nd to 28 outbreak was the defining event of the season so far. An EF4 tornado struck Enid, Oklahoma on April 23rd, the strongest tornado confirmed anywhere in the United States since June 2025, with winds of 170 to 175 miles per hour, a 9-mile ground track, and a width of 500 yards. Homes were demolished. Commercial buildings were reduced to wreckage. Vance Air Force Base was struck and forced to close. Twin simultaneous tornadoes appeared near Foraker, Oklahoma on April 26. Deadly EF2 tornadoes killed at least 2 people near Runaway Bay, Texas. A particularly dangerous situation tornado warning was issued in Stone County, Arkansas on April 27th for a confirmed destructive tornado that stayed on the ground for approximately 10 miles. Over 260,000 people lost power across the Midwest in the final days of April, with 1 fatality reported in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And as of the first week of May, new storms were already targeting the Gulf Coast, Florida, Georgia, and the Southeast Corridor, while the next inland setup was taking shape for the middle of the week. The Midwest is still catching its breath. The Central Plains are still filing damage survey reports, and May is already loading the next round. AccuWeather meteorologist Alex Duffus put the May forecast into plain language earlier in the year. We are thinking that May can be an especially active period this season. The severe weather focus is expected to shift toward traditional Tornado Alley, central Texas to eastern Nebraska, with tornado outbreaks potentially becoming more concentrated across the central and eastern plains. If upper-level dynamics strengthen beyond current projections, May storm totals could exceed forecasts. He also delivered the counts alone. Do not let your guard down this severe weather season, he said. Flash floods and damaging wind gusts can be just as destructive as tornadoes and often impact a much larger area. Flash flooding is a big concern this year. That word, flooding, is one that belongs at the center of the May 2026 conversation alongside tornadoes. Because the other major May threat is not coming from spinning supercell thunderstorms. It is coming from water. The Weather Prediction Center's forecast discussion in the first days of May confirmed a stationary frontal boundary continuing to bring heavy rainfall for Texas and portions of the lower Mississippi Valley, fed by a potent and slow-moving upper-level trough and a prolonged influx of moisture from the Gulf. The WPC used language that demands specific attention. A prolonged influx of moisture will continue supporting heavy showers and thunderstorms as the stationary front supports continuous rounds. A stationary front does not move. It parks itself in place and acts as a trigger line for storm after storm after storm to develop, mature, dump their rainfall, and dissipate, only to be replaced by the next cell forming behind them in the same corridor. The cumulative rainfall from days of continuous rounds over the same geographic footprint produces flooding that is not just a weather event. It is a slow-motion catastrophe for communities that cannot absorb that volume of water. The extended forecast from the WPC out through May 8th layered on additional detail that makes the full scope of what May is setting up become clear. The persistent amplified upper-level low over southeast. Canada is continuing to bring shortwave energy across the central and eastern United States into next week, producing multiple rounds of precipitation and cooler than normal conditions across the upper Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, Great Lakes, and Northeast through midweek. As the front moves southeastward, showers and thunderstorms are expected to expand into the lower Mississippi Valley and into the southeast. The southeast states, already active with severe weather Saturday through the Gulf Coast, are going to see additional rounds of organized convection in the middle of the week. The southeast is also critically in the El Niño amplification zone for increased tornado frequency during the spring and late fall periods. As El Niño builds through the Asto summer, the tornado risk in the Gulf Coast, Dixie Alley, and the southeast does not decrease. It increases. May is also the month when the geographic focus of tornado risk shifts in a specific and well-documented way. The southeast, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana, peaks for tornado activity in March and April. As May arrives, the primary severe weather corridor migrates northward into the Central Plains. Central Texas to eastern Nebraska becomes the bullseye zone. That corridor is where the classic ingredients for violent supercell development converge most powerfully. Warm, moist Gulf air pushing north and colliding with dry air descending from the Rockies along a powerful jet stream, with wind shear profiles that meteorologists describe as among the best on the planet for tornado production. The highest hail risk in May runs from Texas to Alabama and from Iowa to northeastern. Kansas, with AccuWeather specifically flagging that corridor for the possibility of 2 to 3 inch hailstones, and in the most organized supercell setups, significantly larger. But here is the specific and important caveat that separates May 2026 from a typical active May. And it is the same caveat that has defined this entire season. Near average national tornado counts do not mean near average local risk. They do not mean the outbreaks will be small. And they do not mean the strongest individual tornadoes will be weak. The United States averages about 1,225 tornadoes per year and roughly 71 deaths annually. That average obscures the extraordinary range hiding within it. In 2018, only 10 people were killed by tornadoes in the entire country. In 2011, 553 people died. Both years existed within the bounds of what could broadly be called a severe weather season. What determined the difference was not the national count. It was whether the most violent tornadoes hit populated areas. EF4 and EF5 tornadoes represent only about 2% of all tornadoes confirmed in any given year, but they account for approximately 70% of all tornado deaths. The season's death toll is determined almost entirely by whether that violent 2% happens to track through a city, a suburb, a mobile home park, or an open field. The ENSO transition underway right now makes the placement of those violent storms harder to predict with confidence at the seasonal scale than it would be in a settled La Niña or settled El Niño year. The fading La Niña was responsible for the front-loaded, violent plains outbreaks of March and April 2026. The emerging El Niño is beginning to assert its influence, strengthening the subtropical jet stream, pushing storm tracks farther south on average, increasing moisture delivery into the Gulf Coast and deep south, and creating the conditions that historically elevate tornado frequency in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and the Ohio Valley, while reducing classic Tornado Alley outbreak frequency. The transition period between these two states is where the atmosphere is most volatile and least predictable, and it is exactly where the 2026 season sits as May begins. Both ENSO signals are present simultaneously. Both are competing for influence over the jet stream pattern. And the result is a severe weather environment that can produce violent outbreaks across a broader geographic range than either La Niña or El Niño alone would create. Alabama is a state that deserves specific mention in the context of May 2026 because of a statistic that most people outside the state do not know. Alabama averages 14 tornado deaths per year, more than any other state in the country, including Texas and Oklahoma. That is not because Alabama has the most tornadoes. It is because Alabama has the highest concentration of mobile homes, the most nighttime tornado events, the most terrain that disrupts tornado warning reception, and the most communities that lack access to storm shelters. When an EF3 or EF4 tornado strikes a mobile home park in rural Alabama at 11 p.m., the outcome is devastating in a way that the same tornado striking a suburb of Oklahoma City, where nearly every home has a storm shelter or a basement, is not. The May 2026 transition from southeast dominant to plains dominant tornado risk does not mean Alabama, Mississippi, or Georgia are no longer at risk. It means their secondary spring window of elevated risk is still open, while the primary May threat zone shifts northwest toward the plains corridor. Alabama has the 14-death annual average for a reason, and that reason does not go away in May. The non-tornadic severe weather threats in May are also scaling upward in ways that are consistent with what AccuWeather and NOAA projected for the 2026 season months ago. Derechos, the long-lived, fast-moving lines of severe thunderstorms with associated damaging winds extending hundreds of miles, become significantly more common in late spring and into summer. A single derecho event can produce wind damage across 5 or 6 states simultaneously, with peak gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour over a corridor that can be 50 miles wide and 500 miles long. The May atmospheric pattern, with its strong jet stream, abundant Gulf moisture, and the amplified upper-level pattern currently locked in place over the central United States, is precisely the setup that meteorologists associate with derecho formation. AccuWeather specifically flagged derecho risk as a concern for the summer months, and the atmospheric ingredients for their formation are already present in the current pattern. Flash flooding, as Duffus stated directly, is a big concern for the 2026 season, and it deserves to be treated with the same urgency as tornado warnings, because flooding kills more Americans annually than tornadoes on average. The combination of a historically dry spring in many regions and the sudden, intense rainfall that accompanies organized severe weather systems creates a specific and dangerous dynamic. Soil that has been drought-hardened does not absorb water efficiently. When heavy rain falls fast onto hard, parched ground, it runs off immediately into low-lying areas, drainage channels, creeks, and rivers that have not had time to process previous rainfall because the last storm came so recently. Flash flood events develop rapidly, sometimes within minutes of the first heavy rainfall, and the most common cause of death in flash flooding is vehicles entering flooded roadways. The 2-foot rule that NOAA uses in its public communications is not hyperbole. 2 feet of moving water is sufficient to carry away most passenger vehicles. And the same instinct that leads people to check weather apps and shelter from tornado warnings often does not translate to the same level of urgency about flooded roads during active severe weather. The Northeast is also a part of this May 2026 conversation that receives less attention than it deserves. AccuWeather forecasters noted that in the Northeast, severe thunderstorms may not arrive until May or early summer. For states like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, states where severe weather cultural awareness is lower than in the plains, where tornado drills are less common, where storm shelter infrastructure and older building stock is essentially non-existent, and where the population density means that a single significant event can affect hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously. May's northward shift in the severe weather corridor is not an abstraction. It is the arrival of a threat that the region has not been forced to take seriously in the preceding months. The first severe thunderstorm watch of the season in New York City lands on a population that has not been thinking about severe weather since last fall. The preparedness baseline in May is lower in the Northeast than in almost any region of the country, at the same time that the first real severe weather threats of the season are arriving. The travel dimension of May's severe weather threat is one that a recent analysis flagged with specific and practical urgency. After a week of destructive tornadoes in Illinois and the Midwest, new severe storms targeting Georgia and Florida through the first weekend of May were identified as a genuine disruption risk for travelers with plans across the Gulf Coast region. Those with travel plans to the Florida Panhandle, Southeast Georgia, and North Central Florida were specifically advised to check weather updates frequently and plan for delayed or canceled flights and road closures. That advisory matters beyond just flight bookings. May is a month of outdoor events, graduation ceremonies, outdoor sports seasons, and the opening of summer tourist destinations across the South and Midwest. All of those activities carry real exposure to severe weather risk, and the combination of large outdoor gatherings, concentrated populations, and the fast-developing nature of supercell thunderstorms, which can go from first cloud formation to tornado on the ground in under an hour, makes event planning in May 2026 an exercise that needs to include real-time weather monitoring as a non-negotiable component. The overnight tornado problem in May deserves its own dedicated focus because it is the most lethal dimension of the month's threat, and the one that preparedness efforts most consistently fail to address adequately. Tornado warning lead times have improved dramatically, from under 5 minutes in 1990 to over 13 minutes today. That improvement has saved thousands of lives. But those 13 minutes assume someone who is awake and monitoring conditions. At 3 a.m., 13 minutes means very little to someone asleep with their phone on silent, a dead weather radio battery, or no structurally safe room in a mobile home, regardless of lead time. The southeastern United States and Dixie Alley states have a higher proportion of nocturnal tornado events than any other region, a product of the atmospheric dynamics that fuel overnight squall line activity along the Gulf Coast. In May, as storm systems track through the Ohio Valley and the Deep South during overnight hours, the gap between the warning system's capability and the public's ability to act on those warnings is widest precisely when it matters most. A weather alert device with battery backup that can wake a sleeping household is not a luxury in May 2026. It is the difference between a close call and a tragedy. The question that AccuWeather's Duffus framed so directly in his preseason forecast, "Do not let your guard down," is one that applies with equal or greater force at every level of the system right now. It applies to individual families who have not reviewed their shelter plans since the last close call. It applies to school districts and employers who have not updated their severe weather protocols since the last revision. It applies to local governments managing emergency alert systems that are only as effective as the infrastructure maintaining them. It applies to the National Weather Service offices covering the May target zone from central Texas to eastern Nebraska, where staffing levels and operational capacity are questions being actively debated at a political level, while the forecasters themselves are trying to issue life-saving warnings in one of the most active severe weather environments of recent years. And it applies at the national level to a FEMA system that entered 2026 processing 12 simultaneous federal emergency declarations in January for a single winter storm and has been managing continuous severe weather activations ever since. The fire weather dimension of May 2026 also connects to the broader atmospheric pattern in ways that are not immediately obvious. While the Central Plains and Midwest face tornado and hail threats from organized thunderstorm systems, the Southern Plains and parts of the West are simultaneously dealing with critical fire weather conditions, driven by the same dry, windy pattern feeding energy into storm development. The worst spring drought in 131 years of recorded American history has left the Southern Plains and Southwest in extreme fire vulnerability. When the wind energy that drives supercell thunderstorms in Oklahoma also moves into Texas and New Mexico without the moisture needed for precipitation, the result is low humidity, strong winds, dry fuel, and above normal temperatures. The Morill fire in the Nebraska Panhandle had already burned over 600,000 acres in 48 hours earlier in the season. AccuWeather projected between 5.5 and 8 million acres burning nationally in 2026. May's atmospheric pattern does not eliminate that fire risk. In many areas, it intensifies it while simultaneously delivering tornadoes 200 miles to the east. May is the most active tornado month in the American calendar. The 2026 season is running above the historical pace. The Central Plains are now in the peak window for their most violent supercell setups. The Gulf Coast and Southeast are still seeing active organized convection as the El Niño transition begins pushing storm tracks southward. Flash flooding is projected to be a major threat across the Mississippi Valley and the South through the middle of the month. The Northeast is entering its first real severe weather exposure window of the season. Derechos are becoming more possible with each week of warming temperatures. And the El Niño building in the Pacific is adding a layer of fuel and uncertainty to every forecast produced for the months ahead. AccuWeather's Duffus said it before the season started, clearly and publicly. May can be an especially active period this season. If upper-level dynamics strengthen beyond current projections, May storm totals could exceed forecasts. The atmosphere in the first week of May 2026 is already demonstrating that the dynamics are present, the moisture is there, the instability is building, and the pattern that has driven record-breaking severe weather since January is not done. Nobody is ready for what May brings this month. The tornado counts will be watched. The outbreak dates will be tracked. The damage surveys will be completed. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, in the hours before a storm arrives, the warning goes out, the families, the communities, the schools, the businesses, and the emergency systems that are supposed to protect people will be tested again on whether they turned concern into action while there was still time. May does not wait. It never does. And it is already here.